Hey everyone, welcome back to Chess on Ice. This is going to be the second video in the Basic Strategy course series. If you missed the first video, it's also on the channel. It goes over really basic stuff. We talk about why you would throw draws, guards, and hits, what the purpose of each type of shot is for. So if you haven't seen that one, go back and watch it if you feel like you need to. If not, you're welcome to start here as well. And this video series should go on for a while. Right now I have 10 topics planned out, but could be a little shorter, a little longer, depending on how it's going as we move along. So, for the second video in the series, for your next lesson in basic curling strategy, we're going to talk about the difference between how we play when we're ahead and when we're behind in a game. Now, there are many factors that go into picking a shot and to making a strategy for a particular end. But the two biggest factors by far are whether we're ahead or behind, or in general what the situation is on the scoreboard, and whether or not we have the hammer. Now, of those two factors, I'm going to go over scoreboard considerations, whether we're ahead or behind, first. The reasoning for this is pretty simple. While both factors are important, I think that the score is a little bit more dominant. Which is to say that, say you were behind with the hammer, ideally you'd be calling shots that make sense, both from the perspective of having the hammer and the fact that you're behind the game. However, if you had to pick one factor or the other, you're almost always going to be thinking about the fact that you're behind. And if that means you have to throw a shot that's not traditional for the hammer, well, you're going to do it just because you know you're behind and you have to get back in the game. The first thing I want to get to before we get into specifics is talking about how these adjustments we make for score, for whether or not we have the hammer, for other factors like ice conditions, our opponent's abilities, our abilities, all that, how we should use these adjustments. And first and foremost, you're going to play on a team, and if it's a team you play with regularly, you're going to know you have a style and a strategy that you like to play. It might be more aggressive with more guards and draw behinds and big ends. It might be more defensive, where you're more prone to hitting and outlasting an opponent, taking advantage of their mistakes. But either way, that's just a baseline for how you're going to play. So once you have that baseline, you're going to use these other factors to adjust from there. A team that doesn't like to hit, just because they're in a situation that slightly favors hitting, they're probably still not going to hit that much. Now, on the other hand, if you're in a situation where hit's the only reasonable shot to call, it doesn't really matter what your strategy is anymore. That's what you're going to have to do. But there's a continuum here, and you want to make adjustments, not go all the way to one extreme or the other, just because you see that you're ahead or behind or whatever. So let's dig into the most basic, fundamental part of curling strategy that you're going to adjust based on the scoreboard. And that's the question of how many guards do we want to throw. Generally speaking, the further ahead you get, the fewer guards you want to throw. Conversely, if you're falling behind, you're going to want to throw more guards, both during the free guard zone period and after, if you haven't really set up the end you want yet. Why is this? Well, it's really because guards, as we talked about in the last video, are the shots that do the most to add potential scoring to the end. But they do so for both teams. So when you're ahead, especially as you get further ahead, you're not really worried about how many points you can score, right? You just want to make sure your opponents can't get back in the game. So you're not going to help them by throwing guards that give them places to hide. On the other hand, if you're falling behind in the game, you're going to need those places to hide, so it's up to you to create that potential on the ice for you to score multiple points. So here's a quick example, and it's an example I use a lot because it's a simple but very, very common scenario that honestly has a lot to do with a lot of different factors in our curling strategy. And that's, you don't have the hammer and you're throwing the first rock of the end. So if you're new to curling and you've learned the very, very basics of curling strategy, chances are you know what you're supposed to do here, or you know what you've been told to do here, which is, I don't have the hammer, I'm throwing up a center guard. Not a bad idea. And honestly, probably the right play in a neutral sense for a neutral team. So starting from there, you don't know what else to do? Yeah, throwing a center guard's great. But why do we throw that center guard? Well, we want to bring play towards the middle because we don't have hammer. We'll talk more about that in the next lesson. But also because we're trying to threaten to steal a point, right? We want to go eventually around that rock, say like this. And ta-da, we have a place to hide. And congratulations, we're now in position to potentially steal. However, the other team gets to throw before us. And if they go there, now they're using our center guard to potentially help them score. Very simple example of how a guard improves the scoring chances for both sides. It creates areas of the ice where hits are either not possible at all or are at least going to be tougher, right? So let's say we're up by a bit and we really don't want to give the other team a place to hide. We really don't want to think about how we can steal or score points. We're just more concerned about how do we keep scoring down. Well, there's another option here. Second most common shot you'll see without the hammer or as your first rock. We throw to the top of the forefoot. What happens when we do that? Well, there's nowhere to hide, right? We haven't put a guard up, which means that rock's available to be hit. But are we worried about that? Not really. Our opponents could hit that rock, but then they're not hiding either. And remember, we're ahead in this scenario. We're happy to just trade hits and not have a lot of rocks in play, not have that scoring potential for either side, and make them choose whether they want to try to play for one or try something much riskier later to score more. And hey, if they don't hit, which if they're behind they really shouldn't, we can always choose to guard that rock later if we want. But by sequencing it in this order, by throwing that rock into the house first, we haven't given them the chance to go around anything. We've put a rock in play, in a place we want it. If they're not going to hit it, we can then guard it later. Or again, if it's a big lead, we can just leave it there and hit any rocks of theirs. Even if they throw guards later in the end, we can hit those, hit their rocks, make sure they don't get a big end even if we give up 1 or 2 points. Another way of putting this is that the scoreboard basically tells us if our main goal is to score points or to prevent the other team from scoring points, right? We're behind, we want to score points. We're ahead, we want to prevent the other team from scoring as our first priority. Think of it like any other sport. American football season's coming up soon. A lot of my viewers are American or Canadian. You know how that works, right? You start with early in the game, your team might like to pass, might like to run, whatever they do. That's great. The goal is just to outscore the other team and get to a good position for later in the game. Once you're in that fourth quarter, if you're up by 2 or 3 touchdowns, you're going to be running the ball because you don't want to take chances and you want to run the clock out, even if it means your potential to score is lower. On the other hand, even if you're a team that really doesn't throw the ball well, you're going to have to move the ball quickly if you're down by a couple touchdowns and there's only a few minutes left. You just don't have a choice, right? So it's the same way in any other sport or most other sports. It's the same way in curling. When we're behind, we need to take chances and score. When we're ahead, we need to reduce chances, keep things simple, and make it hard for our opponents to make a comeback. So in the scenario we're looking at here, let's say it's our second shot. We have the hammer. We're red. And we have a corner guard up. The team without hammer threw to that top 4 and has it just slightly off center guard. In this case, it doesn't matter what order they did it in. This is the scenario we're looking at now. So what's the right shot for us? Well, it depends on the scoreboard. And let's start from if we're way behind and then move up through if we're way ahead. So if we're way behind, it really doesn't matter what our team's overall strategy is. We're going to have to try to score. And that gives us 2 options. Depending on how far behind we are, if we are really desperate, we might have to throw a second guard, either here or on the other side of the ice, whatever we prefer. We can talk more about that distinction in another episode. But we will throw a second guard so that there is more potential for us to score. Why do we only do that when we're far behind and willing to take a risk? Well, because a team without hammer can throw a second guard or throw a second one in. And you probably have seen this in your own games, skipping or not. This is not an easy situation for red to get out of, especially at the club level, right? We're probably going to have to make a double at some point or hope that yellow misses a couple shots along the way. Even if we can rack up rocks on the side of the house, going to be hard to stop that scoring from happening there in the center with those yellow rocks. So that's if we're way, way behind. What if we're just behind, but we're happy to play for 2? But we really do want 2 with maybe even the potential to get more. And again, this is the scenario we start with. Well, in that case, what we're going to do is we're probably going to draw behind our rock. Right? Maybe to the top of that, right around T-line, just in front of T-line. Even behind T-line's okay because chances are our opponents won't try to freeze on that. What does that do for us? Well, it immediately makes a threat. And I think a lot of new skips don't realize how big that threat is. What red has done is throw a rock in behind a guard, but out of the way of the center. Why do we want to do that? Well, because we really want to keep the center clean without hammer, or with hammer, I'm sorry. Again, that's really the next lesson. But it also means we haven't made things too complicated in the center. If we start getting rid of yellow rocks, eventually maybe we get rid of that one in the middle. Our red rock in the corner scores. And because it's behind a guard, we can get a second rock in and score a second point. All right, what if it's a close game? Well, then it's going to probably come down to our team strategy, right? What is our team good at? What do we want to do? Are we a drawing team? If we're a drawing team and it's close, we might draw down to this rock in the center. Tapping it back a little bit is even pretty good. But even drawing here is very strong if we make a freeze or something close to a freeze, because not easy to get rid of our rock, and we're taking some chance, but we are sitting second shot. And if we can ever make contact with our red rock, we'll get rid of the yellow later, whereas our red is very difficult to get rid of. If we really want to be aggressive, we can also do the draw behind our guard. We threw the guard for a reason, right? Let's use it. That's great. Those are probably the 2 options if we are a team that wants to play aggressively. Down to it is probably the more neutral play, meaning, you know, we're not leaning towards into aggressive or defensive play, really. We're trying to make a pretty non-committal shot. This is probably more of it. What if we are a more defensive team? Well, we're a more defensive team and in a relatively close game. We might throw a relatively soft hit, enough to remove this rock, and probably roll away from the guard. Okay, our rock is open, but we've removed what's in the center of the sheet, so we no longer have to worry about that rock on the top 4. We have a rock that the team has to deal with in one way or another, and we still have some guards to use. So the ball's a little bit in our opponent's court now, how aggressively they want to play. If they draw around, sure, they could still steal because they have that center-ish guard. But if they don't make it, or we're able to get to their rock, we're now set up for a potentially big end, right? Say they try to draw, and the rock pops out a little bit, or even worse for them would be popping out on this side, and we want to hit and roll over here. Well, suddenly this is getting to be a very dangerous situation for yellow, right? And then finally, if we're ahead in the game at this point, if we're ahead in the game, especially if we're well ahead, we're kind of surprised we have this guard at all. Probably not. We were probably trying to throw in and just happened to throw a guard by accident. But in that case, we're probably definitely going after this rock, and maybe with a little more weight. Why with a little more weight? Well, we're not afraid of our rock rolling out, right? We're not worried about that. We're not worried about keeping our rock around because we're not that concerned about scoring. And we want to make sure even if we don't hit this yellow rock that well, like if we hit it pretty thinly, that we're still throwing enough weight to get it out. So we're going to throw a weight that whoever's throwing is comfortable with, but with enough weight to make sure we definitely get rid of that rock. And our rock either rolls out of the house or at least rolls far away from this guard so that it's not very usable for the other team. They aren't going to hit and roll off of it or anything like that. So what about if we're ahead in general? How do we want to play if we're ahead? We talked about guards being a big part of the strategy when you're behind. So what's the strategy when you're ahead? Honestly, you're going to be hitting a lot more than you normally do. Whatever your normal tolerance is, where you decide when you want to hit, be more inclined to hit. For instance, if the opposing team throws their first rock in, and you have the hammer, you're going second, or the other way around. Either way, if there's a rock in play early on, you have a 3-4 point lead or more, probably just boom, knock it out. The closer the game is, say if you're up 2 as opposed to up 8. When you're up 2, you're more likely to want to leave your rock around, so it could potentially score for you and something you have to deal with. If you're up big, it's probably better to roll out, just leave nothing in play, give your opponents absolutely nothing to use. But of course, our opponents aren't always going to give us the option of hitting. They are going to guard, and they're going to try to go around guards. So what do we do when we can't hit rocks in the house? Well, there's 2 things that a team in the lead should think about doing. The first is drawing, and generally speaking, especially early in the end, drawing to places where there aren't guards. Here's why. In this case, if we have hammer, we're happy to draw to the corner. That rock could potentially score for us, but it's not very usable for the other team, right? They're not going to hit it and roll in or anything without hammer. If they make a hit and roll, it's an incredible shot. It's a good 5-foot roll to get behind the guard, and they really should be focusing on drawing. So we make some scoring potential by putting a rock in the corner, but we don't deal with what's going on in the center of the ice. Why not just go around here? Well, this makes perfect sense if it's a close game, right? We talked about that already. Drawing behind the center guard makes sense with the hammer. But we don't want a couple things. One, we don't want to end up back here where they can potentially just freeze on us or come up here, anywhere in this range. Suddenly makes a steal a lot more viable, which is the last thing we want. And honestly, if we have a big enough lead, even this isn't that great, because if they come down to it, now we're in a complicated end where there's going to be a lot of rocks in play. That yellow rock's going to be tough to get rid of easily. And with that guard up, there's definitely a steal possibility. How else should we defend our leads? Well, one of the things you should get in the habit of doing when you have the lead, which is something that is kind of tough sometimes for new skips to call, be willing to peel guards. And that means once we're allowed to, once the free guard zone rule is over, eliminate a guard rather than trying a riskier play that puts you in the house. So you can imagine in this scenario with red, you could certainly draw down here, right? You could maybe even tap this back, and that feels pretty good, right? But that's a shot that comes with a lot of risk for a couple of reasons. One, if you're a little light or you're a little heavy and you bounce off, or God forbid you're very light and you leave another guard. These are all things that really don't help you that much and really play into yellow's idea of complicating things, getting a lot of guards up, shrinking the scoring area so that everyone's playing right around the button. And it's against your general idea of keeping things simple, removing the potential for scoring. Even a perfectly made shot, there's no guarantee you're going to stop them from stealing because they still have this rock on the button. A couple guards up, they can guard again and make it very hard for you to even get to your red rock to tap this yellow out later. So instead, what we should be doing is dealing with these guards, peeling them. And all that means is we're going to throw a good solid weight. Again, you'll hear people talk about peel weight. And if you're playing at the club level, you're pretty new, you're playing with relatively new curlers, you probably don't have a lot of people you play with that are real comfortable with true peel weight. But they might throw control well or even normal. If you use timing, probably not, but hog to hog, maybe they throw a good 10-second rock. And that's plenty to remove a guard. And if that's the weight they're comfortable throwing, have them throw that so they make it. And all you're trying to do is not nose the rock, hit it on the side, pop it out, and your rock goes away. And hopefully theirs goes away too, but even if it just goes to the edge of the sheet, you're pretty happy. A lot of new skips have trouble with this because they look at this and say, yeah, but Ed, I still have nothing in play, and the other team has a guard and a rock on the button. Okay, but the key thing here is you've prevented the situation from getting any worse, and you're working towards potentially even getting rid of their steal situation. There's a couple things they could do here. If they just put the guard back, well, all that's happened is we've essentially knocked a rock off the end. One less rock that can score, one less rock where things could get worse from us. If they try to be more aggressive and pop another one in here, we can get rid of now this guard. Guard goes away. And now, let's fix those rocks up a little bit. Now they have 2 rocks they need to defend that they have to make perfect guards on, because they can't even show us a corner. Like if they half guard, we can start hitting. They have to perfectly guard over and over again. And again, if it's early enough in the end, we can keep peeling that guard, or trying to, and getting to that. But the whole idea of peels is they stop things from getting worse, and they potentially open up opportunities to hit the rocks that are in the house. So a very important tool in your toolbox when you have a lead, especially a substantial lead. So those are just some quick tips on how you should play when you're ahead or when you're behind. To summarize, when you're behind, you're going to be throwing more guards. You're going to be worried more about how much you're going to be able to score than worrying about whether your opponent can score or not. The things you do by throwing guards are going to increase the chances of both teams scoring, but you're not that worried about it if the other team scores, because you're already behind anyway, so you're in a position where you have to take a chance. On the other hand, if you're winning, you're going to be hitting when it's possible to do so, and be focused on throwing draws into the house when hitting isn't an option. You don't want guards, because you don't want to give your opponent more resources they can use, more places to hide, where they can potentially score and get back in the game. It's also important to remember on a few different factors, this is a sliding scale, and this is something we're going to come back to a lot in strategy. There are very few absolutes, and it's very little black and white when it comes to curling strategy. If you're a team that doesn't generally hit, it doesn't mean that as soon as you get the lead, you've got to go all out hitting everything in sight, never thinking about your draw game ever again. No, we're going to make small adjustments, and as the situation becomes more and more clear, we're going to move more towards that sort of idealized strategy, but it's a slow and steady adjustment. There's also a sliding scale in terms of how much risk we're willing to take in order to try to score. If we're way behind, we'll take all the risks in the world. It doesn't matter. We'll risk giving up a big end because we need to score. And if it doesn't work out for us, then hey, at least we did the thing we had to do to try to get back in the game. It's better to throw the Hail Mary pass at the end of the football game than to just take a knee and say, we lost, but it's close. As we get a lead, if we have a small lead, we're still willing to take on a tiny bit of risk, right? We don't have to get into a complete defensive shell. We still want to put points on the board. But if we get a big lead, we're going to not throw a single guard and try to eliminate every threat our opponent makes rather than worrying about scoring. We don't want to be the team that lets our opponent get back in the game just because we were trying to run up the score. I hope that helps a little bit with the idea of how we play when we're ahead, when we're behind, and when the score is close, and how those situations change how we think about an end. Next time we come back for the third lesson, we'll talk a lot more about what it means to have the hammer or not, and how that impacts our strategy, and that's a very important topic too. If you enjoyed this video and you're enjoying this series, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you know when more videos come out in this series and in general on my channel. If you have any thoughts or ideas you'd like to add to this topic, be sure to leave a comment below. And if you're really liking the channel and you want to support what I'm doing here at Chess on Ice, I do have a Patreon, the link's below. You'll get earlier access to videos, you'll see your name in the credits at the end of the videos like you're about to see right now, and you get some exclusive content, including a monthly end review about an end from either a high-level game or a club-level game that has some instructive value that we can go over. Thanks for watching. I hope these videos are helpful, and until next time, good curling.